Well, we come to the end of the book of Jonah. We're going to be taking a look at chapter 4, verses 5 through 11 today. This will finish up our study of the book of Jonah. We are going to be moving into the book of Romans next. I will give you some information about that at the end of this session, but for right now, we want to take a look at Jonah chapter 4, verses 5 through 11. As we take a look at these verses, we want to remember where we have been. At the beginning of chapter 4, we had this conversation, this prayer between Jonah and God. And the prayer went something like this: God, I'm really mad at you for being you. Jonah was upset because God had shown mercy. Jonah was upset because God had shown grace. Jonah was upset because God had brought forgiveness to the Ninevites, and he didn't want that for them. He is very happy to accept it in his life, but he didn't want it for them. And that's where we left off. We left off with a question that God had posed to Jonah, and that question in verse 4 was, is it right for you to be angry? That was the question that God posed to Jonah, and that's where we left off. That's where we were hanging this week, kind of soaking in that question of, is it right for you to be angry? Not, do you have the right to be angry, but is it right for you to be angry? Two totally different questions. Yes, Jonah had every right to be angry, but was it correct? Was it right for him to be angry? And we left that question up in the air for us to answer it, not only for Jonah, but for ourselves. Because remember, this is not a book of prophecy. This is a prophetic book about a prophet. And so we get to see into Jonah's being, we get to see into Jonah's nature, and we get to understand and watching him and listening to him. We see ourselves many times because we all struggle with the nature of God. We all struggle with the decisions that God makes. We all struggle with the trajectory of events in life. And so this is nothing new, and Jonah shows for us the way that he reacts. And in that watching of it, in that living of that reaction, we get to ask ourselves questions. And we get to ask ourselves that question that God gave to Jonah in chapter 4, verse 4, and that was, is it right for you to be angry? And so today we pick up in verse 5, and we begin to see Jonah as that armchair quarterback. And you know what the armchair quarterback is? That's someone that sits on the sidelines and criticizes. Someone that sits on the sidelines, does not participate in what's happening, but takes a fine-tooth comb and picks apart what is happening because they have this perspective of outside looking in. And this is where we're going to find Jonah, for Jonah is going to be the armchair quarterback as he sits and he watches the city of Nineveh. So let's pick up in verse 5. We're going to read from verse 5 down to verse 11 of chapter 4. Then we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at each verse. Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm, which chewed the plant so that it withered. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." But God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" "It is," he said. "I'm so angry I wish I were dead." But the Lord said, "You have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also their animals?" Thanks be to God for the reading of this word. As we take a look at these verses, we see that this is an ending that really doesn't have an ending. It's a cliffhanger. It leaves it open. It's one of those things like when you leave the movie theater and you say to each other, that ending left it open for a sequel. That ending left it open for another movie, for a continuation of it. Well, this ending is a cliffhanger. It leaves things open. And we're going to talk about why, I believe, and a reason why it is left open. And it gives us an opportunity to, again, take a look at ourselves through the lens of Jonah. So let's take a look at verse 5. Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. So in response to God's question in verse 4, Jonah doesn't answer. Remember, in verse 4, God said, "Is it right for you to be angry?" Verse 5 doesn't give us Jonah's response, but yet it gives us Jonah's response because Jonah doesn't answer. He just leaves. Jonah, the answer to God's question in verse 4 for Jonah is to leave. Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. So that leaves us to the question. It says, why did Jonah wait around to see what would happen? We already know what's going to happen. From earlier in chapter 3, we know that the prophecy was shared, that Jonah went into Nineveh and he said, "In 40 days you will be overthrown." And in response to that prophecy that was shared with the Ninevites, everyone from the king all the way down to the sheep put on sackcloth and began to fast. And they changed their ways. And we know in response to that changing of the ways that God extended to them grace, extended to them forgiveness. And so God wasn't going to have them overthrown. God forgave them because of their repentance. And so we know that this is their trajectory because then in chapter 4, in the beginning verses of chapter 4, Jonah bellyaches to God about God's decision to forgive the Ninevites. Jonah bellyaches to God about his mercy. Jonah criticizes God for being God. And so we know what the outcome is. The Ninevites have heard the prophecy. The Ninevites have responded through repentance and wearing of sackcloth and fasting. God then has extended forgiveness to them and is not going to overthrow them. But yet Jonah still, as it says in verse 5, Jonah had gone out and sat down at a place east of the city. There he made himself a shelter, sat in its shade, and waited to see what would happen to the city. So the only reason that Jonah would go out and do this, the only reason that Jonah would stick around and wait to see what was going to happen, the only reason he would go east of the city and build a shelter, meaning he was going to stay there for a little while, the only reason he would do that is because he believed or he hoped in his heart that his prayer, his chastising of God at the beginning of chapter 4 would change God's mind again. And God would now overthrow the city, and he was hoping to see that. So in essence, that's the only reason he would stay, for he knows what's going to happen. That's why he was mad. So the reason why he stayed is because he was hoping that his prayer to God would have been heard, and that his prayer to God would have been answered, meaning God would have said, "Jonah, you're right. I was wrong, you were right. I'm going to go ahead and condemn the Ninevites." So he sets up this shelter east of the city so that he can keep an eye on things. So let's take a look at verse 6. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade to his head, to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. So here's the scene. Jonah builds a shelter, and that shelter is there so he can sit east of the city and watch the city. And that shelter gives them some shade and some protection from the elements. Well, God in his love and God in his grace and God in his caring for his children makes the shelter a little bit better. And it says provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head and ease his discomfort. Do you have discomfort in your translations there in verse 6? Yeah, you might have a different word. I'm reading from the NIV. It has discomfort. So this discomfort that he felt, or whatever the word is used to translate in your interpretation, discomfort is the same Hebrew word as wickedness in chapter 1, verse 2, when it's referring to the Ninevites, and evil ways in chapter 3, verse 10, when it's referring to the Ninevites. So listen to this word again when you put wickedness or evil ways in there as opposed to discomfort. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give shade for his head and to ease his wickedness, or to ease his evil ways. And so there's this provision that God gives to Jonah because of his wickedness, because of his evil ways. There's a provision that he gives to Jonah because of his discomfort, his evil ways, his wickedness. And so God is really in this place not trying to give Jonah shade, but he's trying to teach Jonah a lesson. God is up to something here because he's given him this leafy plant. And remember, the word that is used in verse 6, then the Lord God provided a leafy plant. If you remember, as you think back across the story, there's been several things that God has provided. God has provided a calling at the very beginning of the story for Jonah to go to Nineveh and to proclaim or preach against them. Then God provided a storm so that Jonah would be thrown off of the ship when he was trying to run away and go to Tarshish. And then God provided a huge fish to swallow Jonah up, to give him 3 days to contemplate his decision-making process and his future. And so there's this provision that God is giving. And every time that God gives a provision, the goal is for Jonah to grow, for Jonah to learn something. And so this providing of the leafy plant is the exact same thing, because God is more concerned with Jonah's character as opposed to his comfort. God wasn't sitting up in heaven going, oh, look at Jonah. He's built that little shelter to watch Nineveh, and that shelter's just not adequate. I think I'll give him a leafy plant to make it more adequate. No, God's up in heaven looking at Jonah saying, okay, Jonah's still not getting it. He's still not understanding. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to teach him a lesson, but he's not listening to my words, so maybe he'll listen to actions. And so he sends this leafy plant. Then the Lord God provided a leafy plant and made it grow up over Jonah to give him shade for his head to ease his discomfort. And Jonah was very happy about the plant. Do you have that in your translations? Jonah was very happy about the plant. Now, Jonah was happy that God showed mercy to him. Jonah was happy because, wow, look at this great plant that God has provided. But in the same breath, as he's saying those words, the hope is that he's realizing that he's angry with that very same God for showing that very same mercy to Nineveh. So he's happy when the mercy is extended to him. He's unhappy when the mercy is shown towards someone that he doesn't like. Does that sound familiar to any of us? If we're honest, then we will all recognize ourselves in this picture, because we struggle with this. We struggle with accepting the grace and mercy and love of God when it's extended to someone or a group of people or someone that we don't like. We love the grace, mercy, and forgiveness of God when it's extended to us. It makes us very happy. And that's where Jonah finds himself in verse 6. So let's take a look at verse 7. So verse 7 says, but at dawn the next day, God provided a worm. So remember, God provided the opportunity for Jonah to go to Nineveh. God provided the storm when Jonah was running away from Nineveh. God provided the big fish to give the opportunity for Jonah to change his ways. God provided the leafy plant to give him shade. Now God provides a worm. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. So this worm comes that God has put there, and now this worm chews apart this plant that God has given to Jonah for shade. And the thing is interesting is, how long did it take for that worm to come? In other words, how long did Jonah enjoy the plant? Now listen to the words again. But at dawn, so this is the next morning, the next day. At dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. So there's this sense that this is not very long. It's not like the leafy plant stayed there for 3 days, like Jonah did in the belly of the big fish. But this was just overnight. So this is a very, very temporary thing. Jonah was very happy, wakes up the next day, and this leafy plant is being eaten by this worm and it's disappearing. So in essence, what we see in this verse is that God does to Jonah exactly what Jonah desires God to do to Nineveh, and that is take it back. God showed mercy. God extended grace to Jonah by sending the leafy plant to grow up over his head to give him shade, to make it comfortable. But then he sent the worm to eat the leafy plant so that he had no more shade. So in essence, God is doing to Jonah exactly what Jonah desires God to do to Nineveh, and that is to take his grace and mercy and forgiveness back. And we see that in this verse. But at dawn the next day, God provided a worm which chewed the plant so that it withered. And so we look at verse 8. When the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind. So remember, God provided the opportunity for Jonah to go to Nineveh to preach against them. Then he provided the storm so that Jonah would change his mind and go the opposite direction. Then he provided the big fish so that Jonah would have some time to reconsider his position and get right with God. Then God provided the leafy bush, the leafy plant, to give him shade and the shelter. Then God provided the worm that would eat the leafy plant and take it away. And then God provided, as it says here, when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." He's such a drama queen. Jonah's so drama-filled here. And so there's this frustration that he has. Does this sound familiar to you? Well, it should sound familiar to you. Let me take you back in chapter 4 a little ways to verse 3. "Now, Lord, take away my life, for it is better for me to die than to live." So basically, since verse 3 of chapter 4, Jonah's been belly aching about how it would be better for him to die than for the Ninevites to be saved. It would be better for him to die than for him to sit there and suffer this scorching east wind and the sun beating down upon my head. The drama is so immense here. And the thing that's interesting is that in this passage, we're talking about the heat of the east wind. We're talking about the scorching heat of the sun. And the Hebrew word for angry is literally translated to be hot. That's how you translate the Hebrew word for angry. And so, in essence, Jonah is hot, not because of the sun, not because of the scorching east wind. He's hot because of his anger is burning inside of him. His anger that he has towards God, his anger that he has towards Nineveh. He's an angry guy, Jonah is right now, and that makes him hot. And this is where we get those notions or those sayings that we have, like when someone gets all worked up, we said, hey, cool off, cool down, or hot under the collar. These are all references to the Hebrew translation of the word angry, which means to be hot. And so in this verse, when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint. He wanted to die and said, "It would be better for me to die than to live." The drama is immense here. And so in verse 9, we have God speaking. Now, Jonah has spoke to God. Remember, we're still in this prayer time, even though there's been a little bit of a break. Jonah and God were in prayer, and then Jonah left after the question was asked because he didn't want to answer it, and he made his way out to east of the city and made the shelter. But this prayer is now continuing. It's still a conversation going on. So in verse 9, God said to Jonah in response to, "It would be better for me to die than to live," but God said to Jonah, "Is it right for you to be angry," look at your translations, "about the plant? Is it right for you to be angry about the plant?" Now let's go back up to verse 4 of chapter 4 and read God's first question to Jonah in this prayer. Is it right for you to be angry? Period. That's where we left off last week. Is it right for you to be angry? And we've had to chew on that all week about, is that right to be angry? Not do I have the right to be angry, but is it right to be angry? Now God expands that in verse 9 and says, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? Is it right for you to be angry about the plant? And so we take a look at this notion that Jonah is angry with God for providing mercy, then taking it back. Jonah is angry at God. Now, Jonah might say, I'm angry at the plant. Jonah might say, I'm angry at the world. Jonah might say something else. But really, when you get right down to it, Jonah is angry at God. He's angry at God for having him go and to give a prophecy that you're going to be overthrown, and then in essence taking it back by extending mercy and grace to them. He's angry at God for giving him the leafy plant that gives him the shade in the midst of the scorching east wind and the sun, and then taking it back. So Jonah is angry with God for providing mercy, then taking it back, just like Jonah desires God to do for Nineveh, or do to Nineveh. And so there's this notion of how angry he is. Remember, we talked about in that last verse that angry, the Hebrew word for angry, means to be hot. So there are 3 errors that angry people, or people that are way too hot, make on a regular basis. And Jonah is making these errors. And these are errors that you and I make when we get angry. These are errors that anyone makes when they get angry, regardless of religious affiliation, regardless of belief system. It's just a human trait. 3 errors that angry people make. Number 1, angry people quit. Angry people quit. When you get angry, you take your ball and you go home. And this is exactly what Jonah has done at the beginning of this passage for today. In verse 5, it says, Jonah had gone out and sat down at the place east of the city. So Jonah left. He was angry. God asked him a very profound question in verse 4 of chapter 4, and that is it right for you to be angry? But he never answers that question. He never mulls that over. He never sits with God and kind of puts some flesh on those bones and gets an understanding. He just leaves. And that's an error that angry people make. And you and I understand what that's like because we've been angry before and we have quit. We have taken our ball and gone home. Second error that angry people make on a regular basis is that angry people separate themselves from others. Angry people separate themselves from others. And this separation is not just physical. This separation is relational. This separation is cultural. So angry people make a tendency to use language like them and those people and they, as opposed to us and we. So angry people separate themselves from others, not just physically, but also emotionally, culturally. They make separations because they're angry. This is an error that people make because we were not created to separate ourselves from each other. We were created to be in relationship with each other. We're social beings. And we're created to be in a relationship with each other, and we're created to be in a relationship with God. But when we get angry, when we get hot under the collar, we separate ourselves from each other. And we see that over and over again, not only in our lives, but in the lives of people that we know and love, in lives of the culture around us. We see it on the news all the time, this notion of people separating themselves from others because of their anger. The third error that angry people make is that angry people become spectators. As we said at the beginning of this study, this armchair quarterback mentality, this is what Jonah is doing. He's sitting east of the city and he's made a shelter and he's sitting there and he's going to watch everything that's going to happen. He's going to judge it. He's going to criticize it. And that's exactly what angry people do. When angry people quit, they separate themselves from others, then they sit on the sidelines and they are just judgmental. They just lob judgmental bombs into the situation. They're not involved in it. They're not participating in it. They're not trying to make it better. They're not trying to work on it or improve it in any way. They're just sitting on the sidelines and they criticize and criticize and criticize. That's what angry people do. So those are three errors that angry people make. They quit, they separate themselves from others, and they become spectators. And this is exactly what's happening in Jonah's life. Jonah has become a person who's quit. He's left the city. He's gone to the east of the city just to watch it. He's separated himself from others. He's been separating himself from the Ninevites ever since the very beginning, ever since the beginning of chapter 1, verse 1, when God sent him to Nineveh and he went the opposite direction. He separated himself from them. And also, too, he's become a spectator. He's literally sitting east of the city, hoping and watching for the destruction of the city. Think about how wrong that is. Think about how sick that is, but also, too, turn that mirror back at ourselves and think about how many times we've done the exact same thing. That we have sat on the sidelines hoping for disaster. We've sat on the sidelines hoping for someone to fail. It's exactly what angry people do, and this is where Jonah is in verse 9. And when he's asked that question, is it right for you to be angry about the plant? So we need to take a look at this concept of the plant and understand that a little bit deeper, because God goes into it in verse 10. So in verse 10 starts off with that lovely word, but the Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant, though you did not tend it or make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. So in essence, what God is saying is that, Jonah, you didn't create the plant, but you enjoyed it while it was there. And you didn't do anything to maintain the plant, but you enjoyed it while it was there. And then when it disappeared, something that you didn't either create or you didn't either maintain, when it disappeared, you got mad at God. You say you might be mad at the plant, but you're really mad at God because it went away. And so here this is this notion where God is trying to help Jonah to see how ridiculous his perspective is. You're mad about a plant that you had nothing to do with. You should be thanking your lucky stars that you had at least a part of a day of shade, because if this plant never appeared, you wouldn't even have had that. And that's how we are as human beings, aren't we? We don't look at the blessings and the benefits that we have. We grab a hold of the blessings and the benefits we have, even though we didn't do anything to deserve them. We didn't do anything to earn them. We didn't do anything to make them. We grab a hold of them, and even if we only have them for a short time, when they disappear, we get mad. We get mad at God. How dare you take that away from me? When God's up in heaven saying, whoa, I gave it to you in the first place. You didn't do anything. It's a part of my mercy. And this is the point that God is trying to make to Jonah. The point that God's been trying to make to Jonah all through this book. The point that God is trying to make to you and to me. The point that God is trying to make to the nation of Israel back when this book was written is that mercy arises out of God's character, not anything that we do. So when we get upset at God being God, we need to understand that that's not right. We have the right to be angry at God when God is being God, but it's not right that we get angry with God when God is being God, because God's mercy arises out of God's character and God's actions and God's initiative, and we have nothing to do with it. We didn't do anything to earn it. We didn't do anything to create it. It's not about us, it's about God. And this is where Jonah is, and God is trying to use this lesson to remind him of that. Listen to the words again. But the Lord said, you have been concerned about this plant. You're mad that this plant has disappeared. Though you did not tend it, you didn't take care of it, and you didn't make it grow. It sprang up overnight and died overnight. In essence, you should have been thankful that you had it just for one night. But you're not. You're mad at me now because something that you had nothing to do with, you so quickly gained as your possession. You put it in as your right, your entitlement. And that's exactly where Jonah is right now. And each and every single one of us can understand that perspective because we all struggle with this. We all struggle with this sense of entitlement that, look how much God loves me. I must be great. And that's so flawed. That's not the correct perspective. It's, look how much God loves me. God must be great. And so this is where Jonah is. He's thinking that his entitlement, this notion of saying that, I deserve to have these things, or how dare you take that away from me, when he also, too, is asking God to do the exact same thing to the Ninevites. He's extended grace and mercy and forgiveness to the Ninevites. Now Jonah wants him to take it back, just like he took back the leafy plant. And he doesn't like that for himself, but he'll wish it upon somebody else. And so verse 11 is the drop the microphone moment here, where God gets done talking to Jonah, drops the microphone, and walks off stage. Verse 11, and should I not have concern, this is God continuing to talk to Jonah, and should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals. Boom. That's the end of the passage. That's the end of the book. Jonah is done. And this is a glorious ending. It's a glorious ending because it's a cliffhanger. It's a glorious ending because I think it would have been too easy for us to add on to the end. And Jonah saw the error of his ways and he changed his mind, blah, 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 blah. And that would be like the fairy tale. One of the things that, many people struggle with fairy tales is what happens at the end. And they lived happily ever after. Well, if any of us knows anything about reality, that's not always the case. Doesn't mean that what happened wasn't correct, doesn't mean that what happened wasn't good, but what happened in the past does not directly affect what happens in the future all the time. Sometimes we're thick-headed. Sometimes we don't get it. Sometimes we make new mistakes. We don't make the old mistakes, but we make new mistakes. So there's this openness here. And this is, again, another one of those proof texts that I believe that the Bible is true. I believe that it is real. Because how easy would it have been somewhere down the road, since this book was written, for someone somewhere before the printing press was invented, when you had to copy this by hand, for someone to look at it and say, wow, that ending is it kind of leaves so many things up in the air. I'm going to add another little paragraph there and make a conclusion to it, about Jonah seeing the error of his ways and how he changed and the light came on and all those kind of things. But it's not there. It just ends again with the dropping of the mic and God leaving the scene. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals? He leaves on this question with Jonah. Last week we left on that question, is it right for you to be angry? This week we leave the book on the question of, and should I not have concern? Basically, you're upset at me because I showed concern, but then the concern went away. And you're asking me to do the exact same thing to the Ninevites. And you're okay with that. And so he's leaving this up to Jonah. And the question that we're left with as we leave this book, as we leave this story, as we leave this part of the Bible, is that we are left with the question, Do I think Jonah got it and changed his ways? Do I think Jonah got it and changed his ways? And that's a question that you have to ask for yourself. And it's important because the way that you answer that question will be a direct reflection on how you see yourself in this story. And so it's important for us to answer that question for ourselves. Not for the Bible to give us that answer, not for God to give us that answer. Remember, God is very good at asking probing questions that cause us to think about ourselves. And this is exactly what he's doing. So the ending that God gives us in Jonah is perfect because it's like this invitational altar call. This is one of those times when we've got to make a decision. It's time for us to make a decision. When it comes to an altar call in a worship service, it is basically, I've laid everything out for you. What's your response? And so when we look at this ending, this invitation altar call, we have three questions that we have to wrestle for ourselves at the end of this book. And number one is, have we heard God's call and obeyed? In our lives, in your life, in my life, have we heard God's call and obeyed? Or have we heard God's call and disobeyed? So have we heard God's call and have we obeyed? That's one of the questions we've got to wrestle with at the end of this story. Number two, have we embraced the mercy of God for others? This is a very important lesson that we have got to put together. Not did Jonah embrace mercy, God's mercy for others, but have we embraced it? Or do we find ourselves being Jonah, find ourselves frustrated like Jonah? Are you able to embrace the mercy of God that is shown to other people, especially other people that you don't like or you don't agree with? And the third question that we end on this invitational altar call kind of ending of the book is, have we left justice in God's hands? Or have we taken responsibility for justice and put it in our hands? Do we consider ourselves judge, jury, executioner? Or are we leaving the justice piece into God's hands? Are we understanding that God sees the bigger picture? God knows better than us. And are we leaving that justice issue to God? Or are we taking control of it ourselves? Are we the ones making God's decisions for him? Are we the ones that are speaking for God and not allowing God to speak through us? And so these are the three questions that were left at the end of this mic drop, altar call, invitational kind of ending that this book gives us. And really, when you think about it, it's brilliant because it leaves us leaving the theater wondering if there's going to be a sequel. But also, too, it leaves us leaving the theater saying, what about me? Am I like Jonah? Have I ever been like Jonah? Should I be like Jonah? Is it right for me to be like Jonah? Is it something that I should take a look at? So we're left with all those questions to kind of mull over. And that's just an awesome ending because it doesn't wrap it up in a neat and tidy little bow to make it perfect. It leaves us in that place where we have to ask the tough questions. And so that's where we're going to stop today because it's the end. It's the end. We have gone all the way through the book of Jonah. I pray that there has been a blessing for you in this book, and I invite you to come back next week. Next week, we're going to have the introduction to the book of Romans, and then Romans will be starting the following week after that. So next week, we won't really get into the nitty-gritty of the book of Romans. We're just going to have some background. We're going to lay the groundwork for it. Perfect opportunity for you to invite somebody to join us in this study. Some people are uncomfortable jumping into a study in the middle of something. Oh, you're already in it. You're already in chapter 2 of the book. Well, I won't start it. I'll wait till you start a new one. Well, it's time to start a new one. So let your friends know. Invite your friends to join us and to be a part of the study of Romans. So until we get together again, I pray that you have a great week, that you stay safe and you stay sane. And I will see you next week. Oh, by the way, if I don't see you before Thanksgiving, have a happy Thanksgiving.